The fluorescent lights in Tillman's hardware hummed at a frequency most people stopped noticing after 30 seconds inside the store. Elijah Banks had stopped noticing it 19 years ago. He stood in the electrical supplies aisle on a Tuesday morning at 10:52, holding two switch plates side by side, tilting them slightly toward the overhead light. The difference between the two was in the threading one standard configuration, 1/4 turn, and he had been distinguishing threading variations by touch and by sight, long enough that he did not need to read the packaging to know the difference. He read it anyway. 35 years of work had taught him that the electrician who stopped reading the label was the electrician who made the expensive mistake, and the expensive mistake was the kind of mistake you made exactly once, before you understood why you should never make it again. The aisle smelled of metal and plastic and the faint industrial residue that accumulates in bins of screws and junction boxes and outlet covers, a smell that is specific to hardware stores and to no other place. He knew this smell. He had known it since the previous building before Frank Tillman had expanded the business and relocated across the parking lot to the current structure. The previous building had positioned the electrical supplies toward the back left. This one placed them toward the middle, past the plumbing fixtures between the conduit display and the outlet box inventory. He had adjusted to the new layout without thinking about it. That was what 19 years of familiarity produced: adjustment without effort. Navigation without consulting the signs, the kind of territorial knowledge that belongs to a person and not to a map. He was 69 years old. He had served in the United States Army from 1972 to 1974, during a period in American history when the country was doing several things at once, none of them entirely reconcilable with the others. He had come home from that service with a Purple Heart, and with a particular quality of attention that people who did not know him sometimes mistook for coldness. It was not coldness. It was the quality of a man who had learned to read environments carefully, to register information without reacting to it, to carry weight without announcing it. Composure was not the absence of feeling. It was the disciplined management of feeling in the service of the task in front of you. He had spent 35 years as a master electrician. He had built a reputation that rested entirely on two things: precision and the absence of callbacks. When Elijah Banks wired a house, it stayed wired. When he signed off on a phase of work, the work was complete in the way that complete means permanent and not merely present. He had retired from full-time work 4 years ago, but retirement had not meant the end of working. It had meant the end of charging for it in certain circumstances. He was currently in the 3rd week of a rewiring project for a man named James Hauser, a fellow disabled veteran who lived 12 minutes from Elijah's house in a residential home that had not been properly updated since the early part of the 1980s. The electrical infrastructure of that house was the kind of infrastructure that was not dangerous in a dramatic or immediate way, but was the kind of condition that you found when you opened the walls and looked at what had been done in good faith with inadequate materials and no particular adherence to the codes that had since replaced the standards of that era. It was the kind of house that needed work done on it, work that James Hauser could not afford to commission and could not do himself, because James Hauser's disability involved his hands and certain kinds of sustained manual effort were not available to him. Elijah had said the project was on him. James had started to protest. Elijah had held up one hand and asked about the permit inspection date. 10 days. That was the number. The inspection was in 10 days. That was a workable window, provided the parts arrived on schedule. The specific switch model and outlet covers required for this kind of residential rewiring job were items that Tillman's Hardware kept in stock reliably. That was the reason Elijah was standing in this aisle on a Tuesday morning, comparing switch plates with the calm and methodical efficiency of a man who had spent more time in hardware store aisles than in most other kinds of rooms. He set one plate back on the shelf. He held the other in his left hand, face outward, threading visible. He reached for a second item, a weatherproof outlet cover, and examined the gasket. His reading glasses were in his breast pocket. He put them on. The gasket was the correct thickness. He placed the cover beside the switch plate in his left hand, not to conceal either item, but because his right hand was now free to take a third item from the hook above the outlet. Covers a box of weatherproof brackets that he needed to verify against the specifications he had calculated last week for the Hauser job. He read the specifications on the back of the box with his reading glasses still on. The numbers matched what he needed. He set the box under his arm. He looked back at the switch plates on the shelf, considering whether he needed 2 of the quarter-turn models or 3. He was doing the math in his head, the panel configuration, the number of circuits in the east wing, the sequence of installation. This was the kind of arithmetic that lived in the body after 35 years. He was not thinking about the aisle, or the store, or the morning. He was thinking about the wiring diagram he had sketched on his yellow legal pad 3 nights ago. In the back office of the store, Frank Tillman was on the telephone with his primary distributor, working through a delayed shipment of copper fittings that should have arrived last Thursday and had not. He had a stack of invoices on his desk, a coffee mug that had gone cold 2 hours ago, and a small monitor mounted in the upper left corner of the office that cycled through 4 security camera feeds at 30-second intervals. Aisle 2, Aisle 4, the main sales floor, the parking lot. Frank was looking at the invoices and not at the monitor. If he had looked at the right moment, he would have seen Elijah in Aisle 4, switch plate face outward in his left hand, weatherproof cover beside it, reading glasses on brackets under his arm. The complete and unambiguous posture of a man engaged in the specific task of selecting appropriate hardware for a job. Outside the store in the parking lot, a police cruiser turned off the main road and pulled into the second row. The parking lot was half full on a Tuesday morning, a reasonable number of contractor and homeowner vehicles, the kind of turnover a neighborhood hardware store gets between 8 and noon on weekdays. A woman was loading bags of mulch into the back of her station wagon 3 spaces from the entrance. 2 men in work clothes stood by a flatbed truck with an orange construction beacon on the roof, finishing a conversation before going back inside. At the far end of the row, parked alone with its windows down, was a dark blue pickup truck. On the rear license plate frame were 2 words embossed in metal purple heart. Below the frame, the plate itself was a state-issued veteran's plate, the branch insignia visible in the lower left corner. The truck had been parked there for 11 minutes. Officer Pete Crowley was 34 years old. He had 9 years with the Westfield Police Department. He checked the address on the call log before stepping out of the cruiser. He looked at the entrance of Tillman's Hardware for a moment with the particular expression of a man confirming something he has already decided. Then he opened the car door and went in. An anonymous complaint had been filed 12 minutes earlier. It described a black male acting suspiciously in the electrical supplies aisle of Tillman's Hardware. No staff member at Tillman's Hardware had made the call. No staff member had observed anything that prompted concern. The call had come from a number that would later trace to a disposable device and produce nothing useful by way of identification. The call had simply existed, and the call had brought Officer Crowley through the front door of a hardware store, where in the middle of aisle 4, a 69-year-old retired master electrician was reading the specifications on a box of weatherproof brackets. The bell above the door of Tillman's Hardware had a sound that was specific to this store, a clean double tone that was not quite a chime and not quite a buzz, but something between the two. A sound that had become, over 19 years of visits, part of the ambient texture of the place for Elijah, in the same way that the smell of the aisles was part of it. He heard it now without looking up. He was still doing the arithmetic about the switch plates, 2 or 3, and he had arrived at a provisional answer of 3, which he would confirm by checking the diagram photograph on his phone before he made the final selection. The footsteps that followed the bell were not the footsteps of a customer moving toward a known destination. They did not turn toward plumbing or toward the checkout. They came down the main aisle at a pace that was not hurried and not casual, but purposeful, the pace of someone moving toward something rather than around it. They reached the turn into aisle 4. They entered the aisle. There were 2 other customers in the electrical supplies section. One was standing near the end cap of the aisle, examining a display of flexible conduit. He was a white man in his late 40s, wearing the canvas work jacket of someone in the trades, holding a length of conduit and bending it slightly to test the flexibility. The other customer was at the circuit breaker display a third of the way down the aisle, a white man in his mid-30s holding a piece of paper that appeared to be a panel schedule, running his finger down the shelf inventory and back to the paper, comparing numbers. Both of them were visibly engaged in the business of selecting hardware. Neither of them looked up when the footsteps entered the aisle. The footsteps passed the conduit customer. The distance between the officer and the conduit customer at the moment of passing was approximately 2 feet. The officer did not look at him. He did not slow or redirect. He passed him with the complete indifference of someone for whom that person did not constitute a point of interest. He passed the circuit breaker customer with the same indifference. He walked in a direct and undeviating line from the entrance of the aisle to the place where Elijah was standing and stopped beside him. Elijah looked up. The officer was in uniform, his posture arranged in the practiced neutrality that is not neutral at all, but is the specific posture of someone who has made a preliminary determination and is proceeding from it. He did not offer a name. He did not say good morning. He said he had received a complaint about suspicious behavior in this aisle, and he asked what Elijah was holding. Elijah looked at his own left hand. The switch plate was face outward. The price sticker was visible. The backing paper was intact. The weatherproof cover was beside it in the same hand. Both items entirely visible, not concealed against his body, not tucked under clothing, not palmed in any way that a person familiar with shoplifting concealment techniques would recognize as concealment. He held the hand up slightly, turning the items toward the light. He said the items were in his open hand, and that he would be happy to show the officer the shelf where he had taken them. Crowley looked at the hand. He looked at Elijah. He said the way he was holding the items was consistent with concealment. There are words that do a particular kind of work when they are deployed in the specific way that Crowley deployed them. Consistent with is one of those constructions. It does not assert a fact. It creates a suspicion with the grammatical clothing of an observation, and it does so in a way that is difficult to directly refute because it has not made a direct claim. Elijah was aware of this. He had been aware of the architecture of such statements for a long time. He said the face of each item was visible. The price sticker on the switch plate was visible, and the shelf from which both items had been taken was 4 feet to his left. He turned his head toward the shelf so the officer could follow the direction without any room for ambiguity. Crowley asked to see his identification. Elijah put the switch plate and the cover in his right hand, holding them face outward, and reached into his back pocket with his left. He produced his wallet. He opened it to the front window where his driver's license sat. He held the open wallet toward the officer without removing the license. Crowley took the wallet from his hand. There is a specific experience that belongs to this moment. The moment when something that belongs to you is taken without asking by someone who has the authority to take it. It is not the same as losing the thing. The thing will be returned. It is the removal itself, the gesture, the casual assertion of the right to possess your property temporarily in the course of an encounter you did not initiate and have not caused. Elijah had experienced versions of this moment before. Not always in this precise form, but the underlying grammar of the moment was not new to him. He put his hands at his sides. He did not cross them. He did not put them in his pockets. He let them hang with the visible openness of a man who understands that his hands are subject to interpretation in this situation, and who is going to make their interpretation as uncomplicated as possible. He looked at the middle distance, Not at Crowley, not at the floor, not at the other customers. He breathed with the regularity of someone who is maintaining something that requires maintenance. Pete Crowley had 2 prior complaints in his service record. Both had been filed by black customers at different establishments in the Westfield area. Both had been reviewed at the departmental level and dismissed on the grounds of insufficient evidence of actionable misconduct. In the first case, a man had reported being asked to leave a grocery store parking lot after Crowley responded to a similar anonymous call, and the store manager, who had not been the one to call, had confirmed the customer was a regular and had done nothing unusual. The first complaint had been categorized as a misunderstanding. In the second case, a woman had reported being followed for 3 blocks in her car by Crowley's cruiser after she was observed, in Crowley's words, making an irregular turn. She had filed a written complaint. The departmental review had found that following a vehicle for 3 blocks constituted reasonable observation under uncertain traffic circumstances. The complaint was dismissed. Both dismissals were in the record. Both were findable if someone looked for them with the right question. Crowley looked at Elijah's license. He looked at Elijah. He handed the wallet back. The back office door opened. Frank Tillman came out onto the main floor the way he always emerged between phone calls, looking briefly at the floor and the transitional step, then lifting his eyes to take in the store the way a person takes in a room they know completely. He had owned this store for 22 years, and he had worked in it every day except the 9 days he had taken to bury his mother 7 years ago, and the 12 days he had taken the previous summer when his doctor had been very serious about his blood pressure. He knew what this floor looked like when it was right, and what it looked like when something in it was out of the ordinary. He saw the officer. He saw Elijah. He crossed the sales floor in 8 steps. He said Elijah's name, his first name, the name of a person he recognized, and then he said to the officer directly that this man had been a customer at this store for close to 20 years, that he knew him personally, that there was no concern. He said this with the reasonable authority of a man who is speaking in his own establishment and who believes that his identification of a long-standing customer constitutes relevant information in the present situation. Crowley looked at Frank for 1 second. The look was the look of a man who has heard a piece of information and processed it as irrelevant to his assessment. Then he turned back toward the aisle entrance and said he was going to need the customer to step outside. Frank's face shifted in a way that was small but visible. He looked at Elijah. There was something in his expression that had not yet decided what it was. It was close to an apology, but had not committed to being one, close to a protest, but had not assembled itself into one. He said Elijah's name again. Elijah looked at him. Something passed between them that was too brief and too wordless to fully describe, but it contained the recognition on both sides that the situation had moved past the moment when Frank's statement could redirect it. Elijah put his reading glasses back in his breast pocket. He set the switch plate he was still holding back on the shelf with the deliberate, precise care of a man returning an item he had every intention of purchasing at a later time. He did not drop it. He did not place it carelessly. He set it in its position on the shelf the way you set something you respect, and then he turned and followed Crowley toward the front of the store. Frank stood at the edge of the floor and watched them pass through the door. The bell sounded its double tone. Through the glass he could see the parking lot, the particular quality of the mid-morning light, Elijah's back moving away from him. He stood there for 3 seconds. Then he turned around and went back toward the office. Frank had said he knew the customer. Crowley had heard him clearly. He had not stopped. The parking lot of Tillman's Hardware was a standard commercial lot, the kind that exists in thousands of similar configurations in similar towns across the country. 2 rows of spaces with a drive lane between them, a concrete curb at the far end where the asphalt gave way to a strip of grass, a row of painted lines that had faded somewhat in the summer heat. It was not a dramatic space. It was the kind of space that accumulates detail without announcing it. The oil stain, shaped like a question mark, 2 spaces from the curb, the receipt that had been pressed flat against a wheel stop long enough to become part of the texture of the asphalt. The shopping cart standing at a slight angle 12 feet from the cart returned because someone had aimed it and let go, and it had almost arrived. Elijah stood at the edge of the lot. His identification was in Crowley's hand. The switch plate, the one he had been comparing, the one he had been holding face outward with the price sticker. Visible the one he had set back on the shelf, and then apparently been asked to carry outside because Crowley had taken it from the shelf when Elijah was not looking, and brought it along as some form of evidence of something was on the ground near the front bumper of a car Elijah did not recognize. Crowley had set it on the asphalt without comment and without acknowledgement that the item belonged to the store and not to either of them. There were 15 people who could see this from their various positions. 6 were already outside when they emerged, 2 customers near the front entrance having a brief conversation that had stopped one woman loading items into the back of her car 3 spaces away who was no longer loading items. 2 people walking toward the entrance from the far row who had slowed one man coming out of the store who had stopped holding the door and was letting it fall shut behind him while he watched. The remaining 9 were visible through the front windows, and the still settling front door, a scattering of people at different points in the store who were at angles that made the scene in the parking lot visible without requiring them to position themselves to see it. They were not all watching with deliberate attention, but they were all oriented in the direction of the scene. And the scene included a 69-year-old man standing at the edge of a parking lot with his identification in someone else's hand and a switch plate on the asphalt at his feet. Elijah was aware of all of this. He was aware of it in the way that you are aware of an audience, not because they matter to your performance, but because their presence is a fact of the environment, and facts of the environment are things he had been trained to register. He did not look at them. He looked at Crowley and at the middle distance past Crowley's shoulder. When Crowley was speaking with the settled, unreachable composure of a man who has been making the same calculation for decades and has gotten very precise at it, what can be controlled and what cannot be controlled, and which of those 2 categories the present moment belongs to. Crowley told him he was being barred from the premises pending resolution of the complaint. He said it with the flat, declarative certainty of someone delivering a logistical update rather than a judgment, as though the thing being said had no relationship to the man being said to, as though banning a man from a store he had patronized for 19 years was a procedural matter with no weight on either end of the sentence. Elijah asked what resolution meant in terms of timeline. Crowley said the review process took 60 to 90 days. 60 to 90 days. He had told James Hauser the inspection was manageable. He had given his word, not a qualified word, not a conditional word, but the plain word of a man who understood that the reliability of a promise under pressure was the entire point of a promise. If the word was only good in easy circumstances, it was not a word at all. It was a preference, and preferences were not things you gave to people who were counting on you. The parts he needed were parts that Tillman stocked. His primary supplier could deliver in 11 days. 11 days was 1 day past the inspection. 1 day past meant a failed inspection. A failed inspection in this county meant a rescheduled inspection, and rescheduled inspections in this county meant 6 to 8 weeks of waiting. 6 to 8 weeks meant James Hauser would spend the rest of the summer and into fall with a house that was partially rewired with sections that were isolated and functional but not certified and not complete. Not dangerous. Elijah had been too careful for that, had isolated every incomplete section before leaving each day but not finished. And not finished was the same as broken when you had given your word that it would be finished. He did the arithmetic in his head while Crowley was filling in the field report form he had pulled from his shirt pocket. He did it without showing it on his face. He said, "I understand." Crowley returned his identification. He made a note. He wrote it briefly. He put the form away. He looked at Elijah one more time with the expression of a man who has completed a task and is already occupied by the next item on his mental list. Then he walked back to his cruiser, got in, backed out of the space, and drove out of the lot. The 6 people outside had not moved. The 9 inside the windows were still visible. Elijah stood at the edge of the lot with his wallet back in his pocket and the switch plate still on the asphalt 6 feet away, the price sticker catching the light at a slight angle. The item that had been in his open hand in the aisle now lying on the ground of the parking lot where Crowley had placed it without asking. The public quality of this moment was the part that had its own particular weight. Not the ban itself. The ban was a procedural inconvenience that had legal and practical dimensions that could be addressed. Not even the accusation. The accusation was false, and its falseness would be demonstrable to anyone who watched the tape, which Frank would watch, which Elijah was certain Frank would watch, because Frank Tillman was a man who had built a business over 22 years in a community, and did not appear to be the kind of man who would leave a 19-year customer in a parking lot without, at minimum, watching the tape. What carried its own weight, the particular weight of a very specific and very old form of exposure, was the visibility, the watching. The 15 people who had seen a man standing at the edge of a lot with his identification in someone else's hand, and an item he had been holding in his open hand now lying on the ground at his feet. This was not new. It was the opposite of new. But it was real each time it happened, and each time it was real in the same way and in a new way simultaneously. And that combination was the thing you could not entirely prepare for, no matter how many times you had done the preparation. Inside the store, Frank had gone to the phone. He had called the precinct. He had been on hold for 4 minutes, and then a duty officer had answered and explained the 60 to 90-day review process and told him that if he wanted to contest the ban, he could file a written objection as the property owner. Frank thanked him and ended the call. He sat at his desk in the back office. He looked at the monitor. He found the archived footage from aisle 4 and set it back to 10:45. He pressed play. What he watched for the next 11 minutes was Elijah Banks entering aisle 4 and moving directly to the switch plate display, where he began comparing 2 items side by side. He was unhurried in the way of someone who has a specific technical purpose, not browsing in the casual way of someone who does not know what they need, but deliberate in the way of someone making an informed selection. He put on his reading glasses to examine the outlet cover. He compared the gasket with the careful attention of someone for whom the thickness of a gasket is a matter of professional consequence. He returned one item to the shelf with the precise placement of someone who has been handling merchandise for a long time and does it correctly out of habit. He took a third item from a hook above the outlet covers. He read the back of the packaging. 2 other customers entered the aisle during this 11 minutes. Frank watched where the camera showed them enter. He noted the time. He watched what they did. He watched most carefully what happened when Crowley entered the aisle. He watched the direction of Crowley's approach. He watched the path he walked, the exact line of it from the aisle entrance. He watched the first customer, the conduit customer at the moment when Crowley passed him. He watched the distance. He watched Crowley's eyes in the footage, or at least the direction of his head, and the direction of his head when he passed the conduit customer was forward, and slightly downward, not toward the customer. He watched the second customer, the panel schedule customer who was 4 feet to the left of Crowley's path. He watched Crowley's head as he passed. Forward, not toward the customer. He watched the line of the approach continue without deviation to the place where Elijah stood, and he watched it stop there. Frank sat back in his chair. He looked at the monitor. He looked at the paused footage with Crowley stopped beside Elijah in aisle 4. He picked up the phone and put it down. He picked it up again and put it down again. He went outside. Elijah was sitting on the tailgate of his truck at the far end of the lot. He was not on his phone. He was not in visible distress. He was sitting with his hands in his lap and his eyes on something in the middle distance that was not any specific object, looking the way a man looks when he is thinking, rather than looking when the eyes are aimed at the external world, but the attention is somewhere interior. Frank walked toward him, and as he got level with the rear of the truck, he noticed the license plate frame. He read it. He looked at the state plate below it. He had a brief and disorienting moment of understanding. The kind of moment when something that has been background information for a long time becomes foreground all at once when you understand what you have been failing to understand, not through a new discovery, but through an old fact suddenly acquiring weight. He asked what had happened. Elijah looked at him. He said, "I was looking at switch plates." He said it without inflection and without elaboration. Not because there was nothing more to say. Because the event was the event, and the event did not require additional explanation to communicate itself to a man who had just watched 11 minutes of tape. Frank said he was sorry. He said it without adding anything to it, without a conjunction that would have softened the word by moving toward justification. He said it and stopped. Elijah nodded once. Frank went back inside. He went back to the office. He sat down in front of the monitor. He rewound the tape to the beginning. He watched it again from the beginning. This time, he did not watch Elijah. He watched where Crowley walked. He watched the specific path, the specific direction, the specific decision about who warranted attention and who did not. He watched the two white customers in the aisle and the distance Crowley maintained from them and the absence of a glance in their direction. He watched the one black customer in the aisle and the direct undeviating line to that customer. He watched it twice before he moved. Elijah drove home from the parking lot with the windows down. The air was the particular air of a Tuesday morning in a town that had no reason to be unusual. The air of ordinary commerce and ordinary life, going about its business on an ordinary day. And he drove through it with the same composure he had maintained in the parking lot and in the aisle and in every part of this morning, because composure was not a conditional state. It was not something you maintained while it was comfortable and dropped when it became difficult. It was the whole thing, or it was nothing. He made the calls from his kitchen. He called his primary supplier, the one he had been working with for 11 years, the one who had pulled special stock orders for him on short notice twice before, and who knew his specifications without needing to be reminded. The earliest delivery was 11 days. He knew before he heard the number that 11 days was wrong, but he asked the question and got the answer and thanked the man and ended the call. He called a second supplier. They did not carry the specific weatherproof switch model required for this county's permit inspection, the quarter-turn residential grade that the inspectors in this district would pass without comment, as opposed to the standard models that sometimes generated questions about code compliance in older housing stock. He thanked them and called a third. The third carried the model. They were back-ordered. The earliest delivery was 14 days. 14 days was 4 days past the inspection. 4 days past the inspection in this county meant a failed inspection. He had had enough conversations with enough county inspectors over 35 years to know what a failed inspection on a rewiring job meant in practical terms. It meant a rescheduled date. It meant the rescheduling queue. It meant 6 to 8 weeks at minimum before a reinspection could be arranged. 6 to 8 weeks meant July becoming August, August becoming September. James Hauser's house had sections of the east wing that were not yet certified. They were safe. Elijah had isolated them with the thoroughness that was simply how he worked, not as an extra precaution, but as the standard. But they were not finished, and not finished was the condition James had been living with for years, the condition Elijah had said he was going to end. And ending that condition was the entire point. He called Garrett the attorney. Garrett said the verbal ban was legally thin. Without written confirmation from the property owner, its standing was limited. If Frank chose not to affirm it in writing, Crowley's field order had no formal basis. But entering the store before written clarification from Frank could be used in a complaint proceeding against Elijah. Garrett recommended waiting for Frank's written position before making any decision about returning to the store. Elijah thanked him and put the phone down on the kitchen counter and stood for a moment. He was aware of the dimensions of the situation. He could not enter the store without risking a formal escalation that would make the next 60 to 90 days materially harder for himself and indirectly harder for everyone he had obligations to. He could not get the parts delivered in time through his alternative suppliers. He could contact additional regional suppliers, which he would do, but he had been in the business long enough to know the probability that a fourth supplier would have stock that the first three did not. He called James Hauser. He said the parts were delayed. He said he was working on it. He did not explain the parking lot, or Crowley, or the switch plate on the asphalt, or the 15 witnesses, or the way the afternoon light had caught the price sticker at a particular angle that he would not be able to forget, because the mind stores certain images with a fidelity that has nothing to do with how much you want to retain them. He did not say any of this. He said the parts were delayed and he was working on it. James said he understood. He asked if the inspection date was still possible. Elijah said he was working on it. He ended the call and stood in the kitchen. Through the window above the sink, he could see the oak tree in the backyard that had been there when he bought the house and would be there long after him. He looked at it for a moment. He had planted a garden under that tree 2 years after he moved in, a decision that turned out to be wrong because the shade was too much for what he was trying to grow, and he had moved the garden to the south side of the yard the following spring. That had been correct. The garden on the south side had been producing reliably for 25 years. The oak tree had continued to exist without requiring anything from him. He got his legal pad from the counter and sat at the table. He made a list of the 2 additional regional suppliers he had not yet called. He would call them tomorrow morning. He noted the delivery windows from the 3 suppliers he had already reached. He noted what the project needed in order with the asterisks beside the items not yet acquired. 4 asterisks. The list was orderly and specific and contained everything that was true about the situation, what existed, what was needed, what was outstanding. At the precinct, Pete Crowley typed his field report in the standard template and read it to his sergeant in the afternoon briefing. Suspicious patron complaint. Electrical supplies, aisle hardware store. Subject identified as Elijah Banks, date of birth available in system, no active warrants. Verbal premises ban issued pending property owner confirmation. No items removed from premises. No charges filed. The sergeant said it sounded routine and asked if there were any complications. Crowley said the subject had a Purple Heart plate on his truck, mentioned it as though that changed something. The sergeant said it didn't change protocol. Crowley agreed. He went home. He made dinner. He watched television. The evening was uncomplicated and ended in sleep. Elijah sat at his workbench in the garage that evening. The project materials for the Hauser job were arranged in the sequence he used for every job completed: phases to the left, in progress phases in the center, outstanding items noted on the legal pad to the right. He looked at the 4 asterisks. He checked his phone for a message from the 2 suppliers he planned to call tomorrow. There were no messages. He put the phone face down on the workbench and looked at the materials that were present, the components that had already arrived, the finished sections of the work, the order of operations for the remaining phases. It was all organized and clear and correct. The asterisks were specific and finite. Problems that are specific and finite can be addressed. His phone buzzed. Marcus. He answered on the second ring. Marcus was calling about his daughter Elijah's younger granddaughter, who was 6 years old and had been cast in a school play, and had been announcing this fact to every person she encountered with the specific energy of a 6-year-old who has discovered that she has important news. Marcus described the previous 3 days of the household with the affectionate exhaustion of a father who is simultaneously amused and depleted, and Elijah listened to this and asked the questions that the story required and made the sounds that belong to the conversation, the sounds of a man who is genuinely present, genuinely interested, genuinely glad to be receiving this report from this person about this child. He did not mention the parking lot. He did not mention the 4 asterisks, or the parts suppliers, or the permit inspection, or the officer's field report, or the way the switch plate had looked on the asphalt in the mid-morning light. He asked about the play's costumes. Marcus said she had already decided what they should be and had communicated this to the teacher. Elijah said that sounded right to him. He asked about the older children. He listened to Marcus talk for 20 minutes in the open and unguarded way that Marcus talked when nothing was wrong, and Elijah let those 20 minutes be entirely what they were, 20 minutes of being a grandfather, and nothing else. He said goodnight. He sat in the garage. He looked at the workbench. Then he went inside. His phone rang at 8:14 the following morning. The screen said Tillman's Hardware. He let it ring once more. Then he answered. Frank spoke for a little over 2 minutes. He said he had watched the tape twice. He said he had called the Westfield Community Safety Forum, which was scheduled 12 days from now and had been added to the agenda. He said he was going to present the tape at the forum and add his own testimony, which was going to be specific that Crowley had entered his premises and used them as the basis for a removal that Frank had not requested and not authorized, that the tape did not support the complaint that had been filed, and that he wanted the record to reflect what had actually occurred. He said one more thing before Elijah responded. He said he should have been louder in the aisle. Elijah was quiet for a moment after that. He was standing in his kitchen with the phone at his ear and the legal pad on the counter with its 4 asterisks and its list of options and its delivery windows and the neat handwriting of a man who had organized the situation as clearly as it could be organized. He looked at the legal pad. He looked out the window above the sink at the oak tree. Then he said, "I will be there." The Westfield Community Safety Forum met on the 2nd Thursday of each month at the Community Center on Archer Road. The Community Center was a functional building, beige exterior standard institutional construction, a parking lot that on most forum nights was largely empty. On this particular Thursday in September, the parking lot was full. People had parked along the street. There were cars 3 deep in the overflow area at the far end of the lot. The air had the specific quality of early fall in this part of the country, not cold yet, but carrying the first suggestion of what was coming, the kind of air that makes everything slightly more vivid and slightly more final at the same time. Inside the meeting room held 60 chairs arranged in a U shape with a podium at the open end and a projection screen above it. 31 people were seated. The setup at the front table included a city police liaison, Commander Delgado, a man who had been with the department for 23 years and who had long ago developed the practiced, composed expression of someone accustomed to being in rooms where difficult things were being discussed about the institution he represented. Beside him were 2 city council members, a woman in her late 50s who had been on the council for 7 years, and a man in his mid-40s who had been elected 2 years ago, partly on a community accountability platform. The 4th person at the table was a representative from the mayor's office present in an advisory capacity writing steadily in a notepad. Near the back of the room, a reporter from the local weekly had her small audio recorder on the empty chair beside her and was sitting with the practiced stillness of someone who is trying to take up as little space as possible. Elijah arrived through the side entrance and took a seat in the 3rd row without speaking to anyone. He sat with his hands on his knees and his posture straight in the way of a man who has attended many kinds of formal proceedings and knows how to occupy a chair without making the chair the point. Frank Tillman was 3rd on the agenda. The first 2 items were a traffic safety proposal for the intersection at Main and Cord, which the town engineer presented with calm efficiency, and a funding report for the after-school programming at the community center, which the program director presented with slightly more emotion. Both were handled and concluded. The room paid attention in the way a room pays attention when it has come for a specific item, and is moving through the prior business with the patient endurance of people who understand sequence. When Frank was called, he stood and walked to the podium with a laptop bag over one shoulder. He connected the laptop to the projector cable and waited for the image to appear on the screen. He was not a practiced public speaker. This was visible in the way he stood at the podium, a certain stiffness that came not from nervousness exactly, but from the particular condition of someone who has decided to do something they do not do easily because they have decided it needs to be done. He did not adjust the microphone 3 times, or shuffle papers, or make preliminary remarks about the weather or the forum's good work. He said he had security footage from his store that he was going to present to the room, and that he would say what he needed to say about it before and after, but that the room would benefit most from watching it without commentary. He said, "This is 11 minutes of footage from last Tuesday morning. I am presenting it because what it shows is not consistent with the complaint that was filed, and because I believe this community has the right to see it." He pressed play. The room watched the screen. The footage was the footage, not cinematic, not staged, not produced with any attention to how it would read, just the plain recording of an aisle in a hardware store on an unremarkable morning. Elijah browsing, the reading glasses going on, the outlet cover examined with care, the switch plate face outward in an open hand, the 2 customers in the aisle white moving through their selections, unaddressed. Crowley entering. The path. The distance maintained from the 2 white customers. The stop beside Elijah. The wallet removed from Elijah's hand, Frank himself appearing at the bottom of the frame speaking, gesturing. The walk to the front of the store. 11 minutes. No one spoke during any of it. The council member had put down her pen approximately 4 minutes into the footage and had not picked it up again. Commander Delgado was watching with the expression of a man who is simultaneously doing several things with his face at once, watching the screen processing what the screen was showing him and managing the portion of his expression that was visible to the room. The reporter had stopped writing 2 minutes in and was watching with both hands in her lap. The room was entirely densely quiet in the way that rooms become quiet when something is being witnessed, and the witnessing is understood by everyone present to be a moment that matters. The footage ended. The silence continued for 8 seconds after the image went dark. 8 seconds is not a long time in most contexts. In a room of 31 people who have just watched something, it is a very long time. Elijah looked at the screen for a moment. Then he looked at his hands. The hands of a retired master electrician, 69 years old. The specific hands of a man who had spent 35 years making things work correctly, who had held a switch plate face outward in an aisle and been told the way he held it was consistent with concealment. He looked at those hands for 3 seconds. Then he looked up at the screen again. Frank turned from the screen to face the room. He said he had been doing business in Westfield for 22 years. He said the man in that footage had been shopping at his store for 19 of those years. He said he had not called the complaint and that no staff member had called it in, that no staff member had observed anything unusual that morning. He said the officer who had responded had walked through his store and passed 2 other customers in that aisle without acknowledgement and had stopped beside the one black customer who was present, and that this had occurred on his premises and using his premises without his knowledge, request, or consent. He paused for a moment. Then he said, "I have been doing business in this community for 22 years, and I will not allow my store to be used this way." He sat down. The room took a moment. The kind of moment when something plain has been said and there is no comfortable response that doesn't require engaging with what was said. The council member, the woman who had been on the council for 7 years, spoke first. She said she was formally requesting that the police department conduct a complete conduct review of the incident and of the responding officer's record, and that she would be submitting that request in writing before the end of the week. The second council member said he was joining the request and adding a specific notation that there were 2 prior dismissed complaints in the officer's record that had been reviewed at the departmental level and categorized as resolved, and that he believed those prior complaints warranted examination alongside the current incident under a pattern review framework. Commander Delgado said the department took all formal conduct review requests seriously. He said he would be initiating the appropriate internal review process by the following morning. He said it with the measured professionalism of a man who understood that the tape had made certain things difficult to avoid, and that the appropriate response to that reality was to say the right thing clearly and then make sure the right thing happened. The reporter wrote everything. When the session concluded and the room began to move toward the exits, Frank crossed to the third row. He and Elijah shook hands. Frank said the store ban had not been formally confirmed in writing on his end, and he intended to notify the precinct in writing by the following morning that no ban had been authorized by the property owner. Elijah thanked him. Frank said the parts he had needed were in stock, and that he would have them pulled and ready for pickup by 10 in the morning. Elijah said he would be there at 10. Frank said, "I'm sorry it took this long." Elijah looked at him. He said you did what you did when you understood what you were looking at. It was not forgiveness dispensed cheaply, and Frank understood that it was not. It was an accurate description of what had occurred. Frank had watched the tape and then acted on what the tape showed him. That was the sequence, and the sequence was what it was. Elijah was a precise man. He did not overstate or understate. He said what was true, and what was true was that Frank had watched 11 minutes of footage and done something with what he saw, and that this was worth the precise amount that it was worth, which was not nothing. They walked out of the community center and into the fall evening, and the parking lot was thinning of its cars, and the air was the cool air of a season changing, and neither of them needed to say anything more. The conduct review took 11 weeks in total. This was not fast. It was also not the kind of process that had historically produced the outcome it produced in this case, and the difference between what had always happened before and what happened this time was the existence of the tape and the testimony of a business owner who had presented both voluntarily in a public forum. The review panel watched the footage. They read Crowley's field report. They identified two discrepancies between what the report stated and what the footage showed. They reviewed the two prior dismissed complaints. The first complaint, the grocery store parking lot incident, had been categorized as a misunderstanding and dismissed without a formal finding. The second complaint, the woman followed in her car for 3 blocks, had been categorized as reasonable observation and dismissed without a formal finding. Neither dismissal had been wrong exactly in the sense that the evidence available at the time did not compel a different outcome, but the two prior complaints placed alongside the current incident and examined together rather than separately produced a pattern. The panel documented the pattern as substantiated. Pete Crowley received a formal censure. He was placed on a 1-year probationary period with a conduct monitoring requirement. The field report he had filed regarding Elijah was expunged from the record. He was not terminated. He returned to his duties under monitoring. These were the outcomes the process produced. The process was what the process was, and it had produced something real, which was a censure in writing and a pattern finding in the record, and a field report that no longer existed in the system as a document that could be cited against the man it had falsely described. The parts arrived at Tillman's Hardware the morning after the forum. Frank had them pulled and waiting when Elijah arrived at 10. He drove from the store to James Hauser's house in 11 minutes, which was the usual time. He was there by 11:15. He set up with the same economy of motion he brought to every job. No wasted preparation, no adjusting and readjusting, just the direct movement from arrival to task, because the preparation had been done in advance and the work was already understood. He worked through this morning and into the afternoon. The missing sections came together in the sequence he had planned. He tested each circuit before moving to the next. He checked completed work against the diagram on his legal pad with the same attention he had given to the diagram when he drew it, because the diagram was a representation of what the work was supposed to be, and the work was supposed to match the diagram exactly. By 4 in the afternoon, the outstanding sections were integrated. By 5, the full system had been tested end to end. There were no faults. There were no anomalies. The wiring was clean in the way that Elijah Banks's wiring had always been clean, not minimally adequate, not marginally compliant, but correct in the way that lasts. James Hauser made coffee. They sat at the kitchen table. James said you'd do it. Elijah said that's what I said I'd do. They drank their coffee and did not speak much, which was its own kind of conversation, the kind that two people can have when they have known each other long enough that silence between them is not empty. The permit inspection was on the scheduled date. The inspector, a man named Wallace, arrived at 9 in the morning with the reputation he had for not making sign-offs easy or fast. He went through the work methodically. He checked the panel. He checked the circuits. He examined the permit documentation against the completed scope and found them consistent. He examined the connections. At 10:43, he signed the form. Before he put the form away, he made a note in the margin in his own handwriting. He was not required to make this note. He made it because accurate notation was his habit, and the note was accurate, the installation was clean. Elijah and James stood on the porch while the inspector's car pulled out of the driveway and disappeared down the street. The neighborhood was going about its business, a dog being walked along the opposite sidewalk, a car reversing out of a driveway 2 houses down, the distant sound of a lawnmower somewhere in the direction of the park. The porch railing needed paint on the east section. Elijah noticed this and said nothing about it. James said, "I appreciate it." He said it the way one veteran says it to another, simply without the inflation that the word sometimes carries, not as gratitude for a favor, but as an acknowledgement between two men of something that does not require elaboration to be understood. Elijah said that's what I said I'd do. He drove home by a route that took him past Tillman's hardware. He had not planned this route specifically. It was simply the most direct way from the Hauser house to his own. He passed the storefront. He glanced at it as he drove by the parking lot, the entrance, the sign, the familiar arrangement of a place he had been visiting for 19 years. He did not stop. He had what he needed. He continued home. Inside the store, near the electrical supplies section, in a location that was not prominently displayed but was visible when you were standing in the aisle, if you were comparing switch plates, if you were checking a gasket, if you were reading the back of a package with your reading glasses on, Frank Tillman had installed a small printed sign. It was not large. It did not announce itself from across the room. It said, "This store serves everyone who walks through our door." There had been no press release about the sign. No announcement had been made. The reporter had written her piece about the forum and the conduct review request, and it had been read by people who lived in the community, and some of them had come to the store in the weeks after, and stood in the electrical supplies aisle and seen the sign, and some of them had understood immediately why it was there, and some of them had not needed to understand because they had already known something about why a sign like that might be necessary, and all of them had continued shopping. Elijah Banks drove home through the fall afternoon. He was a man who had maintained his composure in a parking lot in front of 15 witnesses when the cost of maintaining it was real and not abstract. He was a man who had sat on the tailgate of his truck and called his parts suppliers and done the arithmetic and made the calls and watched the options narrow and held the knowledge that James Hauser was waiting and the inspection was coming and his word had been given. He was a man who had sat at his workbench the evening after it happened and organized the 4 asterisks on his legal pad with the same precision he brought to everything, because precision was not a quality you applied selectively only in the easy moments. It was the whole quality, or it was nothing. He had been building this quality for 69 years. Across 2 years of military service that had required things of him that he did not talk about easily. Across 35 years of a career that had required him to be better than adequate in every room he entered. Not because he wanted to be, but because the particular situation of being the person he was in the rooms he was in meant that adequate was not sufficient to be taken seriously. Across 19 years of being a regular customer in a hardware store in a town that knew him by face and name and reputation, and still, he did not carry this weight with resentment. Resentment was not a productive state, and he had never seen it produce anything worth having. He carried it with the same composure he carried everything not invisibly because it was not invisible, but without allowing it to redirect his attention from the work in front of him, which was always the specific, finite, manageable work of the present moment. Dignity is not a thing that is granted. It is not a thing that requires an audience, or a resolution, or a forum, or a tape that shows 11 minutes of a man browsing in a hardware store aisle. It is a thing built over decades of showing up and doing the work correctly and keeping the word you gave and holding the switch plate face outward even when you are the only one in the room who knows that how you hold it matters. It is the particular weight of a man who does not ask anyone to believe him without evidence, who simply produces the evidence. The wiring that passes inspection. The word that holds under pressure. The composure that does not break in a parking lot with 15 people watching, and lets the record be what the record is. The record existed, the work was done, the inspection was signed, the word had been kept. He drove home. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to this channel. There are more stories here. Stories where the record already existed before anyone thought to look for it, where someone who did not have to act chose to act anyway, where the outcome was not perfect, but it was documented, and it was real, and it was not nothing. Stories about what it costs to hold your composure when the cost is real. About what it means when someone else watches the tape and decides that watching the tape is not enough. About the specific weight of a word given to someone who is counting on it, and the specific effort of keeping that word when keeping it requires more than it should have to. Subscribe. Stay for those stories. They do not end with everything resolved and nothing remaining to be said. They end with the record corrected and the work completed, and a man driving home through a fall afternoon with what he came for. They end with the ordinary continuity of a life lived with precision and without apology, which is the only kind of ending that is honest and the only kind that lasts.